She has spent a lifetime watching the world try to define success with shortcuts, noise, and spectacle, and she has also watched her son be misunderstood at almost every stage of his journey. From that vantage point, everything begins to look different. Not smaller, not simpler, but clearer. When you look at life through the eyes of a woman who raised children while rebuilding herself again and again, who modeled resilience before it was fashionable, who walked into rooms where she was underestimated and left them changed, you start to realize that the story you've been telling yourself about limitation might never have been true in the first place. What changes first is your understanding of time. Most people rush because they believe they're late. They compare their beginnings to someone else's middle and assume they've failed. But a woman who has lived through reinvention knows that timing is rarely about speed. It's about alignment. She watched potential take years to mature, ideas look foolish before they looked inevitable, and people be ignored right up until the moment the world needed them most. From that perspective, you stop panicking about where you are and start paying attention to what you're becoming. You begin to understand that slow seasons aren't punishments, they're preparation. Then there's the way you see struggle. Many people think difficulty is a sign to turn back. She learned early that difficulty is often the doorway. When everything is easy, growth is optional. When everything is hard, growth becomes inevitable. She raised children while carrying responsibilities that would have broken many, yet she never framed those years as a tragedy. They were training. And when you absorb that lens, your own struggles stop feeling like evidence against you. They start to look like proof that you are being shaped for something that requires strength you don't yet realize you have. You also begin to see identity differently. The world is obsessed with labels, with titles, with being known for one thing. But she has lived many lives in one lifetime. Model, mother, survivor, mentor. Each phase demanded a different version of her, and none canceled the others out. That changes how you see yourself. You stop clinging to one identity out of fear that changing means failing. You realize that evolution is not betrayal, it's fidelity to growth. You are allowed to outgrow old definitions, even the ones that once protected you. From that perspective, confidence stops being loud. It stops being performative. It becomes quiet, grounded, and deeply unshakable. She didn't need to announce her strength, she demonstrated it by continuing. By showing up. By refusing to disappear when life suggested she should. That kind of confidence doesn't demand validation. It doesn't collapse under criticism. When you internalize that, you stop trying to convince everyone. You focus on becoming so aligned with your own values that outside noise loses its power. Failure looks different too. Most people fear it because they think it's permanent. But a woman who has watched bold attempts fail before eventually reshaping industries understands that failure is often just data. Information. Feedback. Not a verdict. She saw risks taken not because success was guaranteed, but because stagnation was unacceptable. Through that lens, you stop avoiding failure and start avoiding regret. You ask yourself not what if I mess this up, but what if I never try and always wonder. Even ambition transforms. Instead of chasing approval, ambition becomes an expression of curiosity. A desire to see how far an idea can go if given enough persistence. She didn't raise her children to be liked, she raised them to think, to question, to build. That reframes your own ambitions. You stop shrinking them to fit what's socially comfortable. You stop apologizing for wanting more. Not more money, or more attention, but more meaning, more impact, more honesty with yourself about what excites you. You also start to see people differently. When you've been underestimated, you develop an eye for quiet potential. She learned to recognize brilliance that didn't announce itself. Resilience that didn't seek applause. That changes how you move through the world. You become less impressed by image and more attentive to substance. You listen better. You judge less. You stop assuming you know someone's ceiling based on their current position. And in doing so, you extend that same grace to yourself. Fear becomes something else entirely. It doesn't disappear, but it loses its authority. She understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else matters more. Stability, integrity, growth. When you see fear through that lens, you stop waiting to feel ready. You act while afraid, trusting that clarity often comes after commitment, not before. You stop letting fear negotiate the terms of your life. You also begin to understand loneliness differently. The path of originality is rarely crowded. She watched her son pursue ideas that isolated him long before they connected him to others. That solitude wasn't a flaw in the journey, it was a feature. When you internalize that, you stop interpreting isolation as rejection. You see it as a signal that you are walking a path that requires independence of thought. You learn to become your own companion instead of seeking constant reassurance. Success itself starts to look quieter and more complex. Not a finish line, but a responsibility. She saw that achieving something rare doesn't simplify life. It intensifies it. More eyes. More criticism. More pressure to perform. From that perspective, you stop fantasizing about success as an escape and start preparing for it as a weight. You ask whether you're building the inner structure required to carry what you say you want. Your relationship with validation shifts as well. She didn't live for applause, she lived for alignment. When praise came, it was welcomed but not relied upon. When criticism came, it was evaluated, not absorbed wholesale. That changes how you engage with feedback. You stop outsourcing your self-worth. You take what's useful and discard what isn't without bitterness. You become harder to manipulate because you're no longer hungry for approval. You start seeing discipline not as punishment, but as self-respect. She understood that consistency is not glamorous, but it's transformative. Showing up when motivation fades. Doing the work when no one is watching. That's where identity is forged. When you adopt that view, you stop waiting for inspiration. You build routines that carry you through uninspired days, trusting that momentum often precedes motivation. Even love looks different. Love is no longer about possession or reassurance. It's about support for growth. She loved fiercely without smothering, encouraging independence rather than dependence. That reframes your relationships. You stop clinging. You stop fearing that someone else's growth threatens yours. You understand that real connection expands both people instead of shrinking one to soothe the other. The idea of balance also evolves. She knew there were seasons where balance was a myth. Times when focus had to be uneven, when energy had to be poured disproportionately into survival or creation. That perspective frees you from unrealistic expectations. You stop judging yourself for imbalance and start asking whether your current imbalance serves a larger purpose. You begin to respect resilience more than comfort. Comfort maintains. Resilience transforms. She lived through enough uncertainty to know that comfort can vanish overnight, but resilience compounds. That insight changes your priorities. You invest in skills, in mindset, in adaptability. Things no one can take from you. You also stop romanticizing youth and start valuing experience. She became more powerful, not less, with time. That reframes aging as accumulation rather than decline. You stop fearing time passing and start asking how to use it intentionally. You see each year not as loss, but as layering. Responsibility becomes empowering rather than burdensome. She didn't shy away from responsibility, she embraced it as agency. When you take responsibility, you regain control. That perspective dissolves victimhood. You stop waiting to be rescued and start building your own solutions, even if they're imperfect at first. You also see failure stories differently. Behind every overnight success she saw decades of invisible work. That inoculates you against envy. You stop comparing your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. You focus on your own trajectory, trusting that depth takes time. Purpose stops being something you find and becomes something you practice. She didn't wake up one day with everything clear. Purpose emerged through action, through responding to what life demanded with integrity. That shifts your search inward. You stop waiting for a calling and start answering the needs in front of you with excellence. Even uncertainty becomes less threatening. She lived with uncertainty long enough to know it's not an enemy. It's a constant. When you accept that, you stop trying to control outcomes and start controlling effort. You build peace with not knowing, trusting your ability to adapt when clarity arrives. You begin to see that strength and softness are not opposites. She embodied both. Firm boundaries, gentle presence. High standards, deep compassion. That dissolves false choices. You realize you don't have to harden to be strong or shrink to be kind. Your self-talk changes. Instead of asking why is this happening to me, you start asking what is this teaching me? That single shift alters everything. You move from resistance to engagement. From frustration to curiosity. Once that lens shifts, you begin noticing patterns you were blind to before. You see how often people abandon themselves to fit expectations, how many dreams are negotiated down until they're barely recognizable. From her vantage point, that kind of compromise was never safety, it was slow erosion. She understood that being agreeable is not the same as being authentic, and that living a life that looks good from the outside can still feel empty on the inside. When you absorb that truth, you stop asking what will make you acceptable and start asking what will make you honest. You start recognizing that resilience is built in ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. It's in choosing to keep your standards when lowering them would be easier. It's in continuing to care when cynicism feels tempting. She learned that dignity is not something granted by circumstances, it's something practiced daily. That changes how you carry yourself. You stop waiting for perfect conditions to behave like the person you respect. You act your way into that identity now. Your relationship with doubt evolves too. Instead of seeing doubt as a sign of weakness, you recognize it as evidence that you are thinking deeply. She lived with doubt without letting it dictate her direction. Doubt became a companion, not a commander. When you adopt that posture, you stop needing absolute certainty before moving forward. You accept that clarity is often a byproduct of action, not a prerequisite. You also start to see that ambition without grounding can become hollow. She valued achievement, but not at the expense of integrity. Watching success up close taught her that winning without values is a different kind of loss. That awareness reshapes your goals. You don't just ask whether something is impressive, but whether it's aligned. Whether it costs you something you're not willing to pay, the idea of strength becomes more nuanced. Strength is not domination or control, it's endurance with purpose. She didn't need to overpower life to survive it. She adapted, recalibrated, and continued. That kind of strength is flexible, not rigid. When you internalize that, you stop equating vulnerability with fragility. You allow yourself to feel without falling apart. You begin to understand that comparison is one of the quietest thieves of joy. She saw how destructive it can be to measure your worth against someone else's trajectory. Everyone's timeline is shaped by different variables, different starting points, different storms. From that understanding, you learn to compete only with your former self. Progress becomes personal, not performative. Even setbacks take on a different meaning. Instead of seeing them as interruptions, you start seeing them as redirections. She experienced moments where doors closed decisively, only to reveal paths she wouldn't have chosen but ultimately needed. That perspective helps you grieve what didn't work without letting it define you. You honor disappointment without letting it harden into bitterness. You also stop underestimating the power of consistency. Not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that compounds over time. She understood that showing up repeatedly, even imperfectly, builds a foundation nothing flashy can replace. That insight frees you from all-or-nothing thinking. You realize that small, repeated actions shape identity more than occasional bursts of intensity. Your sense of self-worth becomes less reactive. Praise no longer inflates you, and criticism no longer devastates you. She modeled a steadiness that came from knowing who she was beyond roles and opinions. When you internalize that, you stop outsourcing your emotional stability. You become less dependent on external affirmation and more anchored in internal clarity. You also begin to respect solitude. Not as isolation, but as a space for alignment. She valued time alone not because she rejected people, but because she needed room to think clearly. That reframes your relationship with silence. You stop filling every gap with distraction and start listening to what surfaces when the noise fades. Your understanding of courage deepens. Courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the decision to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty, to remain open in a culture that celebrates armor. She chose courage in subtle ways that didn't always get recognized, but they accumulated into a life of quiet authority. That teaches you that courage doesn't need witnesses to be real. You start seeing mistakes as part of craftsmanship rather than evidence of incompetence. She watched innovation emerge through trial and error, through missteps that were necessary for refinement. That dissolves perfectionism. You stop delaying action until you feel flawless and start valuing iteration instead. Your relationship with hope matures as well. Hope becomes less about optimism and more about commitment. Not the belief that things will be easy, but the decision to keep going even when they aren't. She embodied a grounded hope that didn't deny reality but refused to be defined by it. That kind of hope is durable. It survives disappointment because it's rooted in agency, not fantasy. You also start noticing how often people confuse busyness with purpose. She knew the difference. Being busy can be a way to avoid meaningful work. Purpose, on the other hand, often requires stillness, reflection, and deliberate choice. That awareness prompts you to audit your own life. You ask whether your activity aligns with your values or merely distracts you from them. Your view of leadership shifts too. Leadership is no longer about control or visibility, it's about responsibility and example. She led not by commanding attention, but by modeling resilience, adaptability, and integrity. That changes how you influence others. You stop trying to impress and start trying to be consistent. You begin to understand that not every chapter needs to be shared. She lived many formative moments privately, without documentation or applause. That teaches you the value of intimacy with your own process. You stop feeling pressure to narrate every step and allow some growth to happen unseen. Even disappointment with people becomes less consuming. She learned that expectations often reveal more about us than about others. When people failed her, she adjusted boundaries without surrendering compassion. That balance teaches you to protect your energy without closing your heart. You also start seeing patience as an active discipline rather than passive waiting. Patience is choosing not to rush outcomes that require time to mature. She practiced patience not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood process. That reframes waiting periods as engagement rather than stagnation. Your sense of gratitude deepens. Not a forced positivity, but an appreciation for endurance, for lessons learned the hard way, for strength developed through adversity. She didn't romanticize hardship, but she honored what it produced. That allows you to hold gratitude and ambition simultaneously. Without guilt, you realize that reinvention is not a sign that you were lost before, but that you are alive now. She reinvented herself multiple times, each iteration more grounded than the last. That frees you from shame about change. You stop clinging to outdated versions of yourself out of loyalty to the past. Your understanding of influence expands. Influence isn't just reach, it's depth. It's the quiet impact of living congruently, of aligning words and actions. She influenced not by volume, but by coherence. That shifts how you measure success. You value resonance over recognition. You also become more discerning about what deserves your energy. She knew that attention is finite and precious. Giving it indiscriminately leads to exhaustion. That insight helps you say no without guilt and yes with intention. Finally, you arrive at a quieter confidence about your place in the world. Not a grandiose sense of destiny, but a grounded belief that your presence matters because of how you choose to show up. You stop chasing significance and start practicing significance through consistency, integrity, and courage, and as that understanding settles in, you realize the change didn't come from acquiring something new, but from seeing what was already there with clearer eyes. At that point, something subtle but irreversible happens inside you. You stop trying to be rescued by the future. You no longer live as if some distant moment will finally give you permission to feel whole. She learned long ago that waiting for life to settle before showing up fully is a quiet way of postponing your own existence. So you begin to live now, not recklessly, but deliberately, understanding that meaning is built in real time, not awarded retroactively. You start trusting your own discernment more deeply. Not because you believe you'll always be right, but because you believe you can recover, recalibrate, and learn. She understood that self-trust is not about perfection. It's about resilience. When you trust yourself, decisions become less paralyzing. You choose, you act, you adjust. You stop treating every choice as a final verdict on your worth. You also see that clarity often arrives disguised as discomfort. Growth rarely feels neat. She recognized that the moments that unsettled her most were often the ones that expanded her the furthest. That understanding changes how you respond to inner tension. Instead of silencing it, you listen. You ask what it's pointing toward. You allow discomfort to inform you rather than frighten you. Your relationship with control softens. She knew that controlling everything is an illusion that breeds anxiety. Influence, not control, is where peace lives. You begin focusing on what you can shape, your effort, your integrity, your response, while loosening your grip on outcomes. That shift doesn't make you passive, it makes you effective. Energy once wasted on worry is redirected into presence. You also begin to appreciate simplicity. Not because life becomes small, but because clarity removes excess. She understood that complexity often hides avoidance. When you simplify, you see what actually matters. Your values sharpen. Your priorities clarify. You stop cluttering your life with things that don't support who you are becoming. Your sense of belonging changes too. Instead of trying to fit everywhere, you allow yourself to fit somewhere. She didn't belong to every room, and she didn't need to. That gave her freedom. You stop forcing connection where alignment is missing. You choose depth over breadth, honesty over popularity. You grow more compassionate toward your younger self. From her perspective, looking back wasn't about regret, it was about understanding. She knew she did the best she could with what she knew at the time. That compassion travels inward for you as well. You stop punishing yourself for past choices and start integrating their lessons with grace. You also learn that strength doesn't require hardness. Life tried to harden her, but she chose refinement instead. That choice preserved her humanity. You realize that staying open is not naive, it's brave. You protect your boundaries without poisoning your heart. Your idea of success becomes deeply personal. No longer borrowed, no longer inherited from expectations you never agreed to. She understood that a life well lived is one that feels coherent on the inside. When you adopt that metric, you stop chasing symbols and start cultivating substance. You begin honoring rest without guilt. She knew that endurance requires renewal. Rest was not weakness, it was strategy. That redefines productivity for you. You stop measuring your value by exhaustion and start respecting your limits as part of your design. You also recognize that wisdom often speaks quietly. It doesn't shout over the noise of urgency. She paid attention to subtle signals, fatigue, intuition, unease, and adjusted accordingly. That teaches you to slow down enough to hear yourself think, to feel before reacting. Your patience with process deepens even further. You no longer rush to be seen. You trust that what is real doesn't need to be forced. She watched authenticity outlast trends every time. That gives you the courage to move at your own pace, even when it's unfashionable. You start seeing the world less as an obstacle course and more as a classroom. Every interaction, every challenge, every delay becomes instructive. She learned from everything without letting everything define her. That balance keeps you curious instead of defensive. Eventually, you stop asking whether you're enough. The question dissolves, not because you've achieved everything, but because you've accepted your humanity. She knew worth was not earned through proving, but expressed through living honestly. That realization quiets a hunger you may have carried for years, and in that quiet, something powerful emerges: steadiness. Not excitement, not certainty, but steadiness. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. The kind that allows you to face complexity without collapsing into it. That is how everything changes. Not in one dramatic moment, not through external transformation, but through a gradual reorientation of how you see, choose, and respond. The world remains unpredictable, imperfect, and demanding, but you meet it differently now, and that difference changes everything.